Have you received a traffic ticket and don't have time to go to court? Simply upload a picture of your ticket to Elimitix.com and a lawyer will handle it for you. Need your ticket fixed? Go to Elimitix.
I'll say this. That's 4 in a row, baby. That's 4 in a row, baby. Michigan knocks off Ohio State for the 4th year in a row, and we are going to talk all about it. CastellaniContent.com. You can find all the content, all the beautiful, wonderful, sexy things that Austin and I create. And I'll do all the plugs and all that stuff. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Subscribe, like, hit the like button. You can poke me on Facebook. Is that still a thing? Do they poke people? I don't know. Let's talk about Michigan football. Let's talk about the game. One of the most fascinating games in the history of the game. Objectively hilarious. In all my years of watching sports, it's the single most hilarious victory that any one of my teams has ever had. I cannot believe that this has happened. Michigan goes into Columbus and upsets number 2 Ohio State. They were 10-1 coming into this game. Michigan 6-5. I saw Michigan as deep as 23.5-point underdogs at one point. I think the line closed in some at about 19.5 point underdogs. Didn't matter. Michigan not only covered, they won the damn game 13-10. An ugly ball game. An ugly game. As I said in my post game, if I was introducing somebody to the world of football, I'm not showing them that game. That was not a great example of what football can be. But they got the job done, and we're going to talk all about it. Incredible stuff. And this might be a long episode, just mainly with this segment, because there's a lot to break down here. Talking about this game is like trying to break down the most complicated of Christopher Nolan movies. There's just so many layers to it. It's the tenet of football games, I've seen Tenet. I still don't understand Tenet. I kind of like it. And that's how I feel about this game. I'm still not sure if I understand it, but I enjoyed it a great deal. I even enjoyed it more than Tenet. Didn't expect to reference Tenet today, but whatever. Let's move on. This game, when you win it, you earn legendary status, regardless of what you've done coming into that game. And don't get me wrong, whatever criticisms you had of Michigan before the Ohio State game, those criticisms still exist. Okay, I still believe there should be staff changes. I still think that there's issues within the program. We still aren't completely sure if Sharon knows what he's doing. Even after today, we will talk about him. But at the same time, you got to give your flowers, starting with one guy. And the one guy to me who deserves all the flowers, all the roses, all the lilies, all the chrysanthemums is Wink Martindale. Wink Martindale, the highest paid defensive coordinator in the country, in his first experience coaching in the Michigan-Ohio State game, pitched a perfect game, bowled a 300, whatever perfect analogy you want to use. That was a dazzling, stunning, and flawless performance by Michigan's defense. I wish I could break it down in a more analytical manner, but just watching it live or, watching it on television, to me, it's as simple as they were completely prepared and they made every single play in this football game that they had to make and then some. The offense didn't pop off for big plays like they did 2 years ago in the horseshoe, right? J.J. McCarthy wasn't walking through that door, right? But what you got was a defense with a front seven that was a brick wall. Historically in this game, it's almost eerie how consistent this is. You win the rushing battle, you win this game. You are not going to win a rushing battle against this front seven. And Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant and Josiah Stewart, those guys, Graham especially, played the games of their lives on Saturday. Ohio State could not establish any sort of identity in the running game. It was driving Ryan Day nuts. And I think we saw a remarkable amount of hubris from Ryan Day where he just believed, and we'll talk about Day in a minute, but I think that Ohio State has been so butthurt by these allegations of them being soft over the last 3 years that they were trying to cram a round peg into a square hole for 60 minutes against Michigan. We are going to out-tough them. We're going to outman them. We're going to be more physical than them. You couldn't. And those aren't allegations anymore, man. That's just truth. You got beat up. Without Will Johnson, Michigan's secondary, I thought, played a great game. Some of that was Ohio State's play calling playing into their hands. Oops. Sorry, there's NFL receivers. It's the best receiving core in the country, Ohio State. From their standpoint, they probably could have used them a little bit more, but you don't apologize for it. And ultimately, Michigan, they forced turnovers. They got off the field on third down. There was one drive where Ohio State seemed comfortable in this game. It was that drive at the end of the first half. Besides that, nothing came easy. Getting a first down, wasn't easy for them. And I think that's where you give Wink Martindale a ton of credit for having this team ready to go. From a physical standpoint, from a schematic standpoint, they knew what they were doing. They didn't make mistakes. I mean, if you make a minor mistake, if you're not gap sound against a team like Ohio State, you're going to get popped. And Michigan was flawless all day long. And it's where I have to give Sharon a ton of credit. One thing I brought up, and I was wrong about everything with this game, right? I didn't think Michigan was going to win. You kidding me? I don't know. Were there any Michigan fans, like, realistically that were like, oh, I think they're going to win? No, I mean, we figured that this would be the coronation of the last 3 years. And, okay, we had our great run, and now we lost, and oops, and maybe try to get them next year. Wasn't the case, obviously, thank God. But one thing I talked about last week is I did believe Michigan, to a certain extent, had a psychological advantage because of the way that the last 3 years had gone. Those memories for those Ohio State juniors and seniors, the upperclassmen in this team, do still exist. And I felt that if this game got tight in the fourth quarter, it could end up being advantage Michigan. I'll be damned if that isn't what happened. I mean, you got to the fourth quarter of this game and you saw an entire group of guys in scarlet and gray looking around at each other, praying to God that they weren't going to be the guy who screwed it up. It's been talked about many times in this game over the last few years. You can't play scared. You can't coach scared. And Ohio State has consistently done that in this game. How many run plays did they do on 3rd and 8 and longer? I think 3. Maybe it was 2, but there was at least 2 memorable ones. I think there was another one like early in the game where they just kind of punted a drive. I mean, just playing the kind of football that you cannot play against a physical team like Michigan. And I bring up Sharon because when you have the season like what this team has had, where you've taken such significant steps backward, where, let's be honest, I assure you, this team, they don't have trust in their quarterback. They know what their situation is. They know that this has been a down year, and they've lost some games ugly, right? They've lost some games to teams that they shouldn't have lost to, right? They've lost some games that they would have won had they have had a stable or competent QB under center. And the one thing I did think was that Sharon had never lost the locker room. And I think we saw that to a certain extent, really come alive in the Northwestern game where it was senior day and it was the game before Ohio State. And you always kind of see Michigan play sluggish before that game, but they didn't. They played one of their better games of the season. I think that was kind of a precursor to how they looked on Saturday. These guys were totally together for 60 minutes. And I think getting this team that came in as much as 20-something point underdogs to buy in, believe, go into a hostile environment and not blink one time. Not only not blink, but embrace all of it. Embrace the hating, embrace not the fighting necessarily, but embrace the kind of intimidation, I use air quotes there, that the horseshoe is going to bring you, and to come away with it from it relatively unscathed. It's a masterful coaching job. And as far as these players, look, you're a senior class. You played Ohio State 4 times. You beat Ohio State 4 times. One thing I've learned, I didn't realize how much I enjoyed winning this game until Michigan actually did it. It is my favorite thing. In 21, I'm like, oh, they finally got over the hump. It's great. The next year, it felt just as good. The same as the next year and the same as this year. There is no feeling in sports. When people ask you what's the greatest rivalry in sports, the answer is Michigan-Ohio State. It is, because you can say Red Sox Yankees, you can say UNC Duke. No, I'm telling you, it's Michigan Ohio State, because Michigan had a miserable year this year for 11 games. And for some reason, I find myself not caring a whole lot about it after what we just saw on Saturday. This was just a remarkable effort, a shocking effort in a game where things didn't always go right for Michigan. Their quarterback did nothing. He threw for 60 yards. He threw a pick in the goal line, threw another one basically on the other team's goal line, right? Resulted in a missed field goal. That's the other big thing here. Special teams, man. Michigan the last 3 years in this game, the special teams have been on point. Last 4 years, especially. Whether it was Jake Moody or James Turner or Dominic Savada, Michigan has had the advantage in the punting game. They've had the advantage in the kicking game. I say the punting game, and some of these years they didn't punt in the second half of games, but you get my point. That made the difference. I've been watching college football a long time. I've never known of a kicker who has the ability to go 7 for 7 in 50-plus yard field goals. That's what Dominic Savada's done this year. A joke that he's not a Lou Groza Award finalist. And at least the guy had his moment on Saturday, because he's been, outside of Colston Loveland, he's been this team's best, and Khalil Mullings, he's been this team's best offensive weapon. And that's where you go back to Khalil Mullings, who had just a remarkable game on Saturday. A classic Michigan running back performance against an Ohio State team. Bruising, 3 yards a pop, ultimately breaking that big one open on the 3rd and 6 when you knew the ball was going to him and he bounced outside for the play that essentially, at that point kind of put the game on ice or put Michigan in position to ice the game. I wish I could get an explanation as to why Michigan misused Khalil Mullings in the middle of this season. Because Khalil Mullings from day one, from the Fresno State game, you knew that this guy had taken off. He had just taken a next step. And, if I'm selling Michigan in terms of recruiting running backs to this school, if you want an example of how they reload, not retool, 4 years in a row they've beaten Ohio State. And they've done it with 4 different starting running backs. In 21, it was Haskins. In 22, it was Edwards because Corum was injured. In 23, it was Corum. This year, it was Khalil Mullings. The offensive line, which has been much maligned and has not played up to par with what we're used to from a Michigan offensive line this year, they played a really darn solid game. They were not behind the sticks very often, even with the mistakes for the quarterback, even with the turnovers. When it got to the fourth quarter, for the 4th consecutive season, Michigan's offensive line and running game wore down Ohio State's defensive line. And there's multiple factors for that. Part of it is Ohio State's defensive line couldn't get off the field. Michigan held the ball for 13 and a half minutes of a 15-minute fourth quarter. I mean, I don't care if you got the 85 Bears, you're going to wear them down. And so it's like, we bring it up all the time, complementary football. Ohio State played the opposite of that on Saturday, and it's a huge reason why they lost. And that, like I said, that 3rd down run by Mullings late in the game, that's an iconic Michigan moment. And he's handled himself well all year, and had some fumble issues in the early part of his career. He turned himself into a true warrior and a legend with that performance on Saturday. I'm unbelievably happy for the program. We will see what the legacy of this particular version of the game has in store. Because either we look back on it as not a fluke, because Michigan, they were better than Ohio State on Saturday. But what is the version of this program that we can expect? Is it the team we saw on Saturday that knocked off a top 2 ranked opponent? Or is it the team that stumbled and bumbled their way through a 5-loss season in the first 11 games? Is this the turning point? Or are those first 11 games indicative of the kind of football we're going to see? Now, I don't think we're going to see Michigan be a 5-loss team at any point in the future, because I think finally they've learned the error of their ways, which is you can't go into the year without a quarterback. They've lost multiple games because of that. Is it the only reason? No. Is it the biggest reason? Absolutely. It was almost the biggest reason why they lost the game on Saturday. It took an amazing effort from the defense and from the O-line and running backs to just, to pull that one out. I mean, after Davis Warren threw that pick in the end zone, I mean, I think Sharon Moore probably said at some point to Kirk Campbell, like, we're not passing the ball again. I mean, if they could have done direct snaps to Khalil Mullings, they probably would have done it. Quite frankly, just put him in the Wildcat. They're going to run it. But so we'll see what it has in store. But for this moment, it is a huge, huge, huge gut punch to Ohio State and a knockout blow for Michigan. You will never convince me. And I know what I saw on Saturday. You will never convince me that Michigan is a better football team than Ohio State. We were sure as hell convinced on Saturday that they played better, that they deserve to win, and that's really all that matters. But this is where I kind of flip. Great job by Sharon Moore. Great job by these players who've been criticized, throughout the season. It's a remarkable, remarkable moment for the program and a giant, huge upset and potential shift in this rivalry. But that's where I'm going to talk about Ohio State. Usually I don't do this where I spend time dissecting the opponent. But as I said, this game was so fascinating. And Ohio State's performance in this game was so bizarre. If you would have told me it was some like Andy Kaufman-esque art piece of like, we're going to do everything we can to try to lose ourselves a football game, I would like give it a 10 out of 10. Like standing ovation. Unbelievable job. You completely sold me. When it comes to breaking down this rivalry, we are nothing but irrational. We are. Right? Like, I mean, I've literally said at one point in this podcast that it almost makes up for the 5 losses this season. That doesn't make sense. Like, it should just be college football fans and sports fans in general, I'm as guilty of this as anybody, are completely irrational. And over the last few years, while Ohio State, I forget what they did in their bowl game. I know they lost to Missouri last year, but Ohio State was essentially a one-loss football team that was a season ago 30 yards away from winning the national championship. And they went out and they spent $20+ million to try to build the best team they could. I'm not even mad about that, by the way. That's the modern age of college football. I've had my gripes about, that it's the Wild West. I don't care. These are the rules. The rules are that there are no rules. Go and spend how much money you want. That really doesn't bother me. But, it is that added, cherry on top of the sundae that they did all they could to build a team to beat Michigan. If you want to say to win a national championship, sure, but let's be honest, it starts with beating Michigan. Because ultimately they would have won the national championship at least once over the last few years had they've just beaten U of M. And, you look at what Kyle McCord did for Syracuse on Saturday. And that's one thing I said about Ohio State coming into the year is like, of course this team's going to be great, but goddamn, I kind of can't help feel like they panicked a little bit. I mean, you're right there, and you got Michigan at home this year. And you assembled the team that you thought was the best team possible. And it was the best team possible. I didn't come away from Saturday's game saying, wow, I guess Ohio State just wasn't as talented as I thought they were. The reason I'm taking this roundabout way of talking about it is because if you're an Ohio State fan who is pissed today and feel like Ryan Day should be out of a job, this is really the first time where I think that it's extremely justified. There are absolutely zero excuses for losing this football game. And yeah, the players didn't execute, and Will Howard made mistakes, and the defensive line wore down. There's a lot of things you can point to. This was a horribly coached football game by Ohio State. It starts to me with the game plan, because in the first half of this game, I thought that Michigan was playing out of their minds, and they were. But then at the end of the first half, Ohio State realized something. Wait a minute. We're really good, and we have NFL wide receivers, and this team's without the best cornerback in the country. Let's spread out the field, let's throw the ball, and let's score points. That's exactly what they did at the end of the first half, and I said, damn it. We had them for a half, and Michigan played great. But the fact is, they're going to take advantage of the lack of depth that's in the secondary. Ohio State's going to start airing it out. Ohio State's going to get the ball to their skill position players in space, and it's going to be hard for Michigan to stop. Not for lack of trying or game plan, but just because the Jeremiah Smiths of the world, these guys are just really, really good. And I figured Chip Kelly had kind of figured out the formula at the end of the first half for what was going to make them successful in the second half. And guys, I can't stress this enough. They just stopped. They kept trying to run the football against a front seven with 3 NFL players on it. It is one of the most baffling offensive game plans I've ever seen at any level of sports. I mean, you had Joel Klatt and Gus Johnson on the broadcast practically joining the fans at the Horseshoe in booing the offensive play calling, running the ball on 3rd and 10 when you got the ball inside the other team's 20. Michigan should not apologize for it. And you know what? Michigan didn't make the coaching mistakes that Ohio State made, right? Like at the end of the day, they were cleaner than the other team. They were more disciplined as a coaching staff. But the one thing I thought coming into this game was with the athletes Ohio State has, the coaches are going to put these athletes in positions to succeed. They're going to try to get Jeremiah Smith the ball as much as they can. I mean, when you look at the versions of this game that Ohio State has won in the past, I mean, how many times did we hear Chris Olave's name? How many times did we hear J.K. Dobbins' name? How many times did we hear Ezekiel Elliott or J.T. Barrett's name? They knew, get the ball to these skill position players that some of them are going to be first-round picks in the NFL. Get them the ball. I don't care how good Michigan's defense is. If you face these guys one-on-one, you will not be able to knock them off. And we saw that, the nightmare was the 2018 game, obviously, where they were just running crossing routes and Dwayne Haskins was throwing for 1,000,000 yards. Right? In this game, I've tried to get an explanation, and Ryan Day tried to give an explanation, and all it comes down to for me, as I mentioned earlier, is I think it's hubris. I think that Ryan Day was so caught up in this notion, this idea that people have thrown out there, rightfully so, that Michigan was tougher than Ohio State, that Michigan was going to outman Ohio State, that they were going to be more physical, that he just kept trying to do something that you can't do against a front seven that's this good, and it ultimately cost him. And then, I mean, to me, just like you talk about classic, 8 Mile, beginning of 8 Mile, B Rabbit choking at the microphone. I mean, you call a timeout in the fourth quarter on a 3rd and 2, late in the fourth quarter, and you leave the huddle, you leave the sideline with 12 men on the field, and you try to call back-to-back timeouts, which is illegal, and so you get a penalty. That, to me, that's nervous coaching. That's scared coaching. That's this guy don't want to battle. He's shook. This program has regressed. And now regressing from Urban Meyer levels, that's kind of expected, okay? Sometimes people get spoiled. Urban Meyer is one of the greatest coaches in the history of college football. You could argue he's second, okay? There was going to be some regression. But there is no – Urban Meyer would rather chop off his limbs than be within 10 points of a 5-loss Michigan football team. It shows that they have taken steps backward. They have not been prepared schematically to win this game. They have not been prepared psychologically to win this game. They seemed like a scared football team, which was indicative of what looked to be a scared coaching staff on Saturday. It was remarkably shocking watching this team that I've seen for 11 games do explosive things with explosive athletes just fold and try to go against their identity consistently for 60 minutes, and it cost them. It was an amazing game, amazingly happy game, and I guess you could say it ended a little bit ugly, and I guess that's where we'll transition. For the record, I just want to say I hate talking about this stuff. I'm still traumatized from the tunnel incident and everything. I will say up front, I genuinely wish when talking about Michigan football, we would have to spend less time talking about things that happen after the clock hits zero. Okay. And I'm not going to point fingers. I'm not going to play the blame game. To me, it goes around to all sides, right? There have been instances, and I'm not going to break down every one. There have been instances in which I've been disappointed in the way that Michigan's conducted themselves. There's been instances in which I felt like the other team deserved criticism for the way they conducted themselves. And let's jump right into it. At the end of Saturday's game, Michigan, in their celebration, as they did 2 years ago, I believe it was Mikey Sainristil who did this, brought out the Michigan flag, tried to drive it right up to the center of Ohio State's field at midfield, right in the middle of the O, and plant the flag. Ohio State took exception to this. There were fists thrown. There was police officers. There was mace. Guys were pepper sprayed. It was a real ordeal. And, there's obviously, this opened the door for a lot of criticism. To the credit of Sharon Moore, this is now the second time in which he said, we have to be better than that. We can't, that's not how we want to win. That's not what we want to do. He said the same thing after Michigan State. I do credit him. I think Nick Baumgartner put it best on Twitter. He said, it's nice to see that there is an adult in the room. Okay. It's an emotional game. I understand it. I will never try to speak for a football player because if you're watching this on YouTube, you can tell I've never been one. At the same time, in this particular instance, I can't get on Michigan. I understand Sharon wanted to kind of diffuse the situation, and I respect him for being classy. But in this particular instance, I can't do it because, look, I want to say straight up, all fan bases are masters of making excuses. Michigan fans do it all the time. Ohio State fans do it all the time. Fucking Yankee fans do it all the time. Duke basketball fans, Dallas Cowboy fans, take your pick. Every fan base is full of delusional idiots. I speak as someone who is a delusional idiot. Like I'm a part of this crusade, okay? At the same time, if a fan or a fan base is going to make excuses for certain games being lost, I can deal with it, okay? We all cope differently. At the end of the day, what Jerry Goldsmith 864 on Twitter says about the 2022 Michigan-Ohio State game is generally kind of irrelevant. They're welcome to have their opinion. I'm not going to call out every Tom, Dick, and Harry who feels the need to share their thoughts on Twitter because I am one of those Tom, Dicks, and Harrys. But for 4 years, the Ohio State program, the players and the coaches have gone to the podium after losses. And with exceptions, and there were exceptions, Travion Henderson was a big exception on Saturday. You have heard guys make excuse after excuse after excuse as to why they lost this game. In 2021, guys had the flu and the weather was bad. In 2022, I think Jim Knowles said, if we just don't give up those 5 big plays, we win the game. Right? Yes, those 5 big touchdowns. That's how football's played. In 2023, they found an excuse, not just for 2023, but for the previous years as well, because, Connor Stallions is sign stealing. It's the whole reason Michigan was ever good. And despite the fact Jim Harbaugh and Connor Stallions weren't on the sidelines last year and Michigan still won, they still made that excuse. And then this year you play, outside of the COVID year, the worst Michigan team I've seen in a decade, easily the worst Michigan teams in a full season that I've seen since Hoke. And there are no excuses for this one. And I mean this psychologically, not physically. Don't put your hands on people, but act like a bitch, get slapped like a bitch. I'm sorry. Usually I'm not like this. But the fact is, Ohio State would have been better off over the last 3 years, or at any point in the last 3 years, after 21, after 22, accepting this fact. You had it good. You had it perfect for a long time. For 15 out of 16 years, this was your rivalry. And the one year you didn't win, it was kind of a fluky year where Tressel got fired and Fickell was the interim head coach. You had a 7-loss football team. Does it count? Yes, but kind of counts on a technicality, right? This was your golden age of Ohio State football. The fact is you got very comfortable for a long time with Urban Meyer. And you got very comfortable in the early years of the Ryan Day that this was going to last forever. Here's what's happened over the last four years. Okay? And it's varied. But you have gone up against a Michigan team that was more prepared than you, that was tougher than you, that was more disciplined than you. And in some of those instances, like 2023, you just have to accept that maybe, just maybe, Michigan had some better players than you did. Or at the very least, they had players that were more equipped to win that game than you were. Because you can throw all the 5-star wideouts and running backs that you want. But when you have guys at the line of scrimmage who are just manhandling you, you're going to lose this game. That's why you lost. It had nothing to do with the weather. It had nothing to do with big plays. It had nothing to do with counter stallions. And this year, it had nothing to do with what you're going to blame Davis Warren for this one? Taking it a step further. I'm not saying it's nice, and I'm not saying it's right. But I saw at least 5 instances of teams winning a rivalry game on the road on Saturday, going to midfield and planting their flag at midfield. It's happened to Michigan twice this year. It happened against Texas and it happened against Oregon. Why are you so different? And even though I'm a Michigan fan, my heart does break for guys like that. They came to Michigan. They came to Michigan. No, they didn't. They came to Ohio State to beat Michigan. You leave losing 4 times, which nobody expected, twice at home. I understand the heartbreak. I understand living the rest of your life, like going to your grave hating Michigan. But I kind of think Khalil Mulling said it best in this particular instance. Some people got to learn how to lose. And Sharon, I felt like, had an all-time quote after the game where they said, "What are your thoughts on losing gracefully?" And he said, "I don't know. We didn't lose." Moving on, we are going to talk Lions. I want to talk about Michigan State football because, believe it or not, I actually have a lot to say about them as well. Michigan State loses their final game of the regular season at home to Rutgers. They finished the year 5-7. Let's break this down. So if you would have told me coming into the year that Michigan State would have finished 5-7, I wouldn't have been shocked. In fact, their Vegas over-under was 4.5 for wins. You could argue just from that metric alone that they overachieved. All right. Here's what's very bizarre to me about this Michigan State team is they started this year and played the first 7 games of this season as a Jonathan Smith team. I said, wow, they've shed a lot of the baggage from the Tucker era. They're tougher. The offensive line is better. They're starting to establish an identity. They're going to have a quarterback who's going to figure some things out. You know, he's raw and he's turning the ball over, but he's going to be pretty good. You have a star wideout in Nick Marsh, and you know what? The defense has gotten significantly better. Those secondary breakdowns that you saw in the Tucker era are just gone. So they looked like the team that I expected Jonathan Smith to have through 7 games. In the last 5, they turned into a Mel Tucker team, which is a team that was soft at the line of scrimmage, that was inconsistent at the quarterback play, that was consistently, hilariously outcoached in the second half of games. Shout out to David Harns, who's a friend of the program. We haven't had him on, but he is a friend of the program. Known him for a long time. He tweeted something out that shocked me. With the exception of Prairie View, Michigan State did not outscore an opponent in the second half of a game all season. That's on coaching. And like I said, 5-7 on its own isn't horrifying, but I'm sorry, a 27-point loss at home to Rutgers to end your season, that is horrifying. Michigan State football got embarrassed on Saturday by Rutgers. And Rutgers, look, they're obviously not anything special, but Schiano is the perfect Rutgers coach. They have gotten better as a team and as a program over the last several years, and they were way more prepared to win that football game on Saturday than Michigan State ever was. I brought it up the other week with Jonathan Smith and about how some people are annoyed by his lack of fire. And like I said, it wouldn't annoy me if I didn't feel like the team's energy was starting to match his own. Those teams came out flat these last few games. I mean, you have an opportunity, at the very least, in the first year of a coaching regime, you have a chance to punch your ticket to a bowl game. That means something. I understand the goals are greater than that in the long term, but go back to D'Antonio. In his first year, Michigan State had to win that last game against Penn State to punch their ticket to a bowl game. That's what they did. They pulled off the upset in 07. It was a big kind of a jumpstart moment for the program in D'Antonio's first year. You had that opportunity this season, and you not only lost, I mean, you got completely manhandled, making many of the same mistakes that you not only made throughout this season, but you've made the last several years. How in the world is Michigan State football so terrible at converting 4th and 1? I don't think I've seen them do it in 3 years. They line up for 4th and 1. You know what's coming. It's a run play and guy gets stuffed every time. This has now existed in 2 different coaching tenures. In my opinion, what Michigan State football can be is somewhere between where they were in the heart of the D'Antonio era and where they were this season. I don't believe that the possibility of them sustaining a 3-year run in which they're a top 5 program in the modern age of college football is legit. I think it's the Big Ten's expanded. There's so many teams you have to leapfrog, so many things that have to go right. It's just really tough. And that's not even that much of a criticism towards Michigan State as much as it is like, you know, the rich get richer in college football. That's mainly the case. But I also don't think Michigan State should be going 5-7 every year. And the fact is, this is a program right now, as it pertains to their football program, that seems very unserious. And not only very unserious, remarkably fractured. You would expect a program that's in year 1 with a new coach to at least be somewhat united. Hey, we're in this together. Last thing ended in disaster. We got a lot of new players. Let's see how it goes. And there's the frustrations with Smith and the athletic department and the players and the fans it's very apparent. And I think what Michigan State wants more than anything, of course, it's to win games. Of course, it's to compete for the Big Ten and beat Michigan. I understand all that. But right now, you appear to have a football program and an athletic department that hasn't really committed to much of anything. What are your goals with NIL? What are your goals with the football program? Do you want to win the Big Ten? Is your goal to want to make the playoff, or is it just to maintain that 8 to 10 win range? If it's just to maintain that 8 to 10 win range, I think you're doing it wrong, because your goal as a program of Michigan State's caliber, your goal needs to be to aim high. I don't care if it's Rutgers, Minnesota, Michigan State. If your goal isn't to reach the summit, then you're doing it wrong. And I think a lot of Michigan State fans right now are getting the impression that Michigan State's goal is just to kind of be average, that they're content with average because, I don't know, at least they're producing revenue. They're not scaring anybody. You have basketball to fall back on. I don't know what their rationale is. And this may be a very too tough of a rant towards the current state of Michigan State football after 1 year under Jonathan Smith. But I am very surprised at the regression that we saw in the second half of this season. And I do think there are some legitimate issues. I've never been a believer that a coaching staff or a group of players are immune to criticism because it's year 1 under a new regime. I remember going nuts about that with the Tigers when they were losing 114 games in 2019, and people were telling me, look, hey, it's year 1. It's year 1, or not year 1, but it's early in the rebuild. You got to give Avila time. You cannot win and still maintain a winning culture. I didn't really see a winning culture from Michigan State this year the way that we did in the early part of the D'Antonio era. Yeah, they went 7-6 in his first year, but you really saw the gears turning. You saw a toughness. You saw fire. Yeah, they lost to Michigan in that first year, but they had a 10-point lead in the fourth quarter. It was an indicator of what was to come for that program. If what we saw from Jonathan Smith in year 1 is an indicator of what's to come for Michigan State, I think there could be trouble because, yes, he had success in Corvallis. I would argue it's not really not much of an argument as much as it's fact. The expectations at Corvallis are much different than the expectations are at Michigan State. You lose to Oregon at Oregon State, it stinks. You lose to Michigan at Michigan State, your ass is grass. And Michigan, despite pulling off one of the biggest upsets we've seen in a minute in college football on Saturday, was completely outplayed by Michigan State in the first half of the game that they played in Ann Arbor. And when you look at the box score of that game, total yardage, rushing yardage, Michigan State did a lot of things that could have won them that game. Coaching blunders cost them. And so I'm not saying he's on the hot seat by any means, but I think you can have legitimate concerns while also acknowledging that he deserves time to kind of develop this thing on his own. And he does. They're going to get another opportunity next year. He deserves another opportunity in year 3 pending something completely disastrous. But if I had to go off a pass-fail system, I would not give Jonathan Smith a passing grade in year 1. If you would have told me year one was going to end with 10,000 people at Spartan Stadium watching Michigan State get shellacked by the Scarlet Knights in a snowstorm, even I would have been surprised. So yeah, tough place to be in. Moving on. We're going to cover this just a little bit because this has been a very long episode, as I kind of expected. The Detroit Lions, who the theme of today's episode of I'll Say This is coaching malpractice, because the Lions won on Saturday or Saturday. Jesus God, I got put in head to the fullest right now. They won on Thursday, Thanksgiving, which is when that holiday is held. They beat the Bears. They survived against the Bears. It was not without a cost. I have wondered throughout this season, what's it going to take for the Lions to, at the very least, not be the last team standing in the NFC? And throughout this season, I've just felt like, if you line up against Detroit and Detroit plays their game, Detroit will beat you. Detroit's now officially has an issue, and it's nothing to do with their personnel or the talent. It's as simple as the injury bug. It is adding up. I mean, the consistency in which guys are getting banged up. Now, you see stuff like Zadarius Smith, I think, hobbled off 3 times, came back, right? And had a huge game on Thursday against the Bears. But you now got Malcolm Rodriguez out for the year with a torn ACL. You got Alex Anzalone, who's out, I don't know, probably 4 to 6 more weeks, I would guess. I can't remember. I think he got injured against Jacksonville. You got Aiden Hutchinson, who's out until the Super Bowl, if you make it there. I don't care how deep and how good your defense is. And don't get me wrong, this defense has been very impressive this year. Those are huge losses. And as much as I trust this offense, I think we got a little bit of an indicator on God, I keep saying Saturday. I'm so obsessed about the Michigan-Ohio State game. I think we got a little indicator on Thursday of what can happen if the offense doesn't play their A game, because they were dominating that football game. It should have legitimately been 28 or 35-0 at halftime of that game, or halftime against the Bears, because the Bears could not get a first down and didn't. The Lions were driving up and down the field, and all of a sudden that team that struggled to put the ball in the end zone in the first 2 games showed up again, and they couldn't finish drives, and they were kicking field goals, and it was a 16-0 game that felt like it should have been about 28 or 35-0. And in the second half, the offense stalled out a little bit. Bears came alive, and this defense, which I don't really think did anything wrong from a schematic standpoint, was just banged up, almost got beat. And the reason you won was, number one, you made a huge defensive play at the end with Zadarius Smith sacking Caleb Williams and knocking him out of field goal range. And for what I'm about to say next, that is worth noting, because the Bears were really driving, and it seemed like they had all the momentum, and you found a way to plug the hole. That was very impressive. And then Matt Eberflus lost his bleeping mind. I have been watching football a long time. I have never seen the clock mismanaged like that. Some of it on Caleb Williams, a lot of it on Matt Eberflus, and I've even said after the game in my post game, he should be fired before they get off the bus. He was fired the next afternoon. I have absolutely no clue what they were doing. That is one thing. I don't understand how so many smart football coaches, not to say Eberflus is some genius. I mean, the guy just got fired. But I don't know how so many smart coaches just bungle clock management. At the very least, when Chicago, after the Zadarius Smith sack, I said, well, okay, cool. Now we get to go to overtime, and hopefully we win the coin toss. The idea of we're going to run 33 seconds down and finish off this game is just, it was one of the most shocking, unbelievably stupid coaching moves I've ever seen. Not that I've made, I don't coach. And from Caleb Williams' standpoint, I would say that's a little bit of choking on him. Try to change the play. You have to know the clock. It's like the most important thing in the final 2 minutes of a football game is the clock. I'm happy the Lions won, but I'm just mad on principle as somebody who enjoys watching pleasant things. That was not pleasant. So look, I'm obviously, Dan Campbell said it after the game. We can't get to a place where we're ranking wins, right? It is hard to win in this league, and the Detroit Lions, one of the most inept organizations of all time, has now won 10 NFL games in a row. I don't care if they would have won every game like how they won on Thursday. That is unbelievably impressive, and it's even more impressive with the amount of injuries that they've had, the adversity they fought through, and having to play. These weren't cakewalks. Houston, they were down 16. Minnesota, they were losing late. I mean, these were close games that they were able to finish. Not every game was Jacksonville. I think this is a perfect season in many ways in terms of how these games are going, because they've won games easily, where they've blown teams out. They've boat raced them and put up historically good offensive numbers, and they've won some games ugly. You know, the Bears game got a little bit ugly and a little silly at the end. You don't apologize for coaching mistakes. And for what it's worth, the Lions for decades have been the team that has had the coaching staff that you never trust towards the end of games is going to make the right decisions. It's the opposite now. And look, he'll roll the dice in his fourth downs and everything. I get it. But Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, I think at this point are about as trustworthy in a late game situation as any other coaching staff in football right now. And that at some point, maybe it won't be till the playoffs, maybe it won't be till the NFC Championship game of the Super Bowl. At some point, that is absolutely going to matter. And to a certain extent, we saw it matter on Thursday when the Lions were able to prevail after the Bears forgot how clocks work. All right. Whew. Stretching out. Quite an episode. Good episode today. Had a lot to get off my chest. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. And if you did, you can find everything that Austin and I create at CastellaniContent.com. There is the one-stop shop for all the videos we do. Michigan basketball is in full swing. We will talk about them next. This episode ran a little bit long, but Fort Myers Kings, Michigan basketball looking really good. Michigan State basketball looking pretty darn good. We're going to be in the full swing of things with that here coming soon, but obviously those things take a backseat to the big football games of the week. You can follow me on Twitter/X at Castellani 2014. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you don't want to look at my ugly mug and you want to just listen to this thing in audio form, the process is good. Austin and I are working very hard. We're going to have Anthony Bellino on Chris and Company this week, the voice of Chrysler Center, the voice of Ford Field. At least they're in-game entertainment. I do want to get what his official position is because I like Anthony a lot. I don't want to fumble that. He's been known him for a minute. I've done his show. Now I appreciate the fact that he's going to be returning the favor. Means a lot. And it means a lot that you guys continue to support and listen. We really are putting in the effort to try to put out the best stuff possible. It's crazy how quickly time goes by in life. That we went through an entire baseball season and now an entire, at least regular season of college football. I don't know what this means, but I'm ready to step back into the arena. I don't know what that means. It just felt meaningful. Now I'm a philosophizer. All right, I'm rambling. Thank you guys very much for tuning into this show. We'll be back next week with another episode. We'll be back this week with a new Chris and Company. 4 in a row. Michigan got it done. All right, y'all. Have a great rest of your day. Peace and happiness.